This is George Square in Glasgow, Scotland. The man on the top of the column is Sir Walter Scott, a man who saved Scottish culture, transformed the genre of historical novels, and influenced many writers around the world. Sir Walter Scott was born on the 15th of August, 1771, in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was the ninth child in his family. His father, Walter, was a solicitor, and his mother, Anne, looked after the children at home. His mother would read him stories of Scottish history and folklore. Although he was born into a wealthy middle-class family, he suffered from a serious health challenge. At a young age, he contracted polio, which left him with a permanent limp. He was sent to live with his grandparents in the Scottish Borders region. From a young age, Walter was told stories and legendary tales by his elderly relatives about Scottish history, and he soon became deeply interested in poetry, history, drama, fairy tales, and romances. He had a remarkable memory and impressed guests with his enthusiastic poetry recitals. His explorations of the countryside gave him both a love of natural beauty and a deep appreciation of the historic struggles of his Scottish ancestors. He attended the University of Edinburgh, where he studied law following in his father's footsteps. Although not always at the top of his class, he was an eager learner and an avid reader. During his university years, Scott continued to immerse himself in ancient and modern literature. He was particularly drawn to the works of Shakespeare and the Gothic novels. This period was crucial for developing his literary tastes and skills in storytelling. After university, Walter initially pursued a career in law, but he continued to have a strong interest in literature and history. His first major literary work was Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border in 1802, which was a collection of Scottish ballads and other poems, including some of his own. He produced a number of poems that were very well received. The poems featured clear and vigorous storytelling, depictions of Scottish culture, emotional depth, and vivid portrayals of the Scottish landscape. Inspired by the success of his poetry, Walter turned to writing novels. His first novel, Waverley, was published anonymously in 1814 and was a major hit. It was the first of what would be known as the Waverley novels, a series of historical novels that remain highly influential today. His first novel, Waverley, was written in a way that had never been done before. He paid close attention to historical details in his settings, clothing, and speech, making his narratives feel authentic and well-researched. He skillfully blended fictional characters with historical events and real historical figures, allowing readers to experience history through the eyes of relatable characters. His novels often explored themes of Scottish identity and history, contributing to a renewed interest and pride in Scottish culture and heritage. Walter's novels appealed to a wide audience by combining adventure, romance, and moral dilemmas, making them accessible and entertaining while still being intellectually stimulating. This approach set the standard for the genre of historical novels and influenced countless writers in the 1800s and beyond. He influenced many world-renowned writers such as Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Leo Tolstoy, and Charles Dickens, and many more. Before Scotland joined the United Kingdom in 1707, the people of the Scottish Highlands had a strong culture and identity. The social structure of the Scottish Highlands was distinctly organized around clans. Clans were large, extended family groups, with each being led by a chief, who had considerable power over the clan's territory and its members. Most people in the Scottish Highlands spoke Gaelic. Tartan, kilts, and bagpipes were commonplace. Each clan had a different tartan associated with them. Music, dance, and storytelling was part of Highland life. After Scotland joined the UK in 1707, the British government sought to control the Scottish Highlands. This and other factors led to the Jacobite Risings. The Jacobite Risings were a complicated series of uprisings by the Jacobite forces against the British military. The Jacobite armies were mainly Scottish Highlanders, although there were allies from various other nations and regions. The Jacobites were defeated at Culloden in 1745. The British government implemented policies aimed at breaking the power of the Highland clans, which were seen as a threat to the stability of the state. Laws were enacted to abolish the traditional rights of chiefs, ban the wearing of tartan and carrying of arms, and to suppress the Gaelic language. Many Highlanders were evicted from their ancestral lands to make way for sheep farming and other more profitable agricultural practices. This was known as the Highland clearances. The wearing of tartan and playing of bagpipes were banned for a period, and the education system promoted the English language over Gaelic. These measures were intended to assimilate the Highland population into the broader British culture, diluting their distinct cultural identity. The Highlands were cleared of its people, and the Highland culture was mostly destroyed. The Highland culture was now associated with rebellion and backwardness. This was the era of the Scottish Enlightenment, which involved an outpouring of intellectual and scientific accomplishments. It produced significant advancements in various fields, such as philosophy, economics, science, and literature. This was the time of David Hume, Thomas Reid, and Adam Smith. The Scottish Enlightenment promoted rationalism and modern economic practices, which contrasted sharply with the traditional clan-based lifestyle of the Highlands. Highland culture, with its Gaelic language and distinct customs, was often seen as antiquated and a barrier to progress and integration into the modern British state. This was the Scotland that Walter Scott grew up in. Scottish culture and identity was at an all-time low. Walter Scott, with his passion for literature and his love for Scotland, used his novels to cultivate and celebrate Scottish culture and identity. His works like Waverley, Rob Roy, Bride of Lammermoor, The Heart of Midlothian, and Ivanhoe are not only entertaining narratives, but also deep dives into Scottish and British history. These novels brought to life the Scottish landscape, history, and its people, influencing perceptions of Scotland worldwide. Scott was deeply involved in the revival and promotion of Scottish culture. This was evident through his writing, which often incorporated Scottish folklore, Gaelic and Scots language, and Scottish traditions. He used his narratives to paint a romantic and appealing picture of Scotland, contributing significantly to a renewed interest in Scottish history and heritage during the 1800s. Scott was instrumental in reviving the Scottish tartan and Highland dress. His role in the 1822 visit of King George IV to Scotland is particularly notable. He organized the event, encouraging the wearing of Highland dress, which helped to popularize the tartan globally as a symbol of Scottish identity. Scott was keenly interested in Scottish history and worked towards the preservation of historical artifacts. He collected a vast amount of Scottish weapons, clothing, and relics, and his home at Abbotsford showcases a rich array of such items, becoming a personal museum of Scottish history. Scott's literary depictions of the Scottish landscape, its rugged mountains, misty lochs, and ancient castles, drew visitors from across Britain and beyond. This not only boosted local economies, but also established a tourism sector that appreciated Scotland's natural beauty and historical depth. In his novel Rob Roy, he depicts Rob Roy as an honorable man. Rob Roy is an outlaw, but he is a protector of the weak and oppressed. He shows a profound commitment to his family and clan, which is a central aspect of Scottish Highland culture. Rob Roy's resistance against English authority and his involvement in the Jacobite cause are portrayed as acts of patriotism and courage. His defiance of oppressive forces paints a picture of the Scottish spirit of resistance and the fight for national and personal sovereignty. Rob Roy also represents the preservation of Scottish culture, particularly the Gaelic language and Highland customs. His character is an embodiment of traditional Scottish values and ways of life, promoting a positive view of Scotland's unique cultural identity. Although Walter Scott was a proud Scot who made efforts to revitalize Scottish culture and identity, he had strong conservative political views. He had conflicting views on Scotland's future. On the one hand, he welcomed Scotland's union with England and the commercial progress and modernization that it promised to bring. But on the other, he bitterly regretted the loss of Scotland's independence and the steady decline of its national identity and traditions. His portrayal of Scottish culture was typically nuanced and avoided political controversy. He presented Scottish history and characters in a way that was palatable to both Scottish and English readers, thus sidestepping potential political and cultural sensitivities. In his literary works, Scott often explored the historical tensions between England and Scotland, but typically portrayed these conflicts within a narrative that ultimately affirmed the Union's value. His historical novels, while rich in Scottish heritage and critical of certain aspects of English rule in historical contexts, do not advocate for separation, but rather for mutual respect and understanding within a united Britain. With the great earnings he made from his book sales, Scott began building a large estate near the Scottish border on the banks of the River Tweed in 1817. This mansion-sized building was constructed over several years, with Scott adding to it gradually. It has a blend of Gothic, Elizabethan, and Scottish baronial styles, showcasing a collection of historical relics, armor, and weaponry, along with an extensive library filled with rare books and manuscripts. He created a personal museum of Scottish history. There are even locks of hair from Bonnie Prince Charlie and Napoleon Bonaparte. The building still exists today and is a popular tourist attraction. Scott became a silent partner in a printing and publishing company in 1805. The company published many of Scott's own books, along with those of other popular authors of the time. Despite its initial success, the company was not managed efficiently. By 1826, it was evident that the company was in serious financial distress. Scott was personally liable for the enormous debt of around £120,000, a massive sum at that time. The realization of this debt came as a shock to Scott, who had not been fully aware of the extent of his financial exposure. Instead of declaring bankruptcy, which would have discharged his debts, Scott chose to repay his creditors in full. This decision was both morally driven and influenced by his desire to preserve his personal honor and reputation. Scott worked tirelessly to pay off his debts through his writings. He increased his literary output significantly, publishing novels, poems, and non-fiction works, often at a remarkable pace. His efforts included some of his major novels, such as Woodstock, The Fair Maid of Perth, and his famous Tales of a Grandfather. The strain of his financial situation and his relentless work schedule took a toll on his health. Despite this, Scott continued to write until his health severely deteriorated. In 1830, Scott suffered a series of strokes, which severely impaired his health. His first stroke left him partially paralyzed on one side, and subsequent strokes further deteriorated his condition. By the time of his death in 1832, Scott had managed to pay off a substantial portion of his debts, though not entirely. His estate continued to generate income after his death, and eventually his creditors were paid in full. Walter Scott masterfully integrated various contemporary novel-writing techniques with his profound interest in Scottish history and lore. He skillfully employed the omniscient narrator, incorporated regional dialects, and utilized detailed local settings, along with nuanced character development and romantic themes expressed in a realistic style. Through this synthesis, he effectively created what is now recognized as the historical novel. His impact on novelists across Europe and America was immediate and significant. Although the popularity of some of his works waned in the 1900s, his literary stature is still well regarded and enduring. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you want to see more.